But what were some of the other ways that the Russian military had modernized after Georgia ends and before Crimea?
I mean, it's even more than equipment, it's in organization. Look, the Russian military up to that point had, as I said, pretty much been the Soviet military, just a writ smaller. And the Soviet military was always essentially built as a machine for mass mobilization. It was essentially still operating under the shadow of the Second World War. And that need to, well, we might find ourselves in a position where we literally have to be fielding a million-man army. Now, what does that require? Well, obviously, you can't have a million people under arms at the same time, too expensive and such like. But nonetheless, that's why you have conscription, so that you have a huge pool of reservists who at least have had enough basic training so that they know which is the dangerous end of a Kalashnikov, and who can be called up to arms in the case of a big war. And yet, what was clear at the time, or seemed to be clear at the time, was that actually Russia didn't honestly face the threat of a big war. It had its whole notion of war fighting was built around an increasingly mythical scenario. NATO was not about to roll eastwards across the border. The Chinese is more of a threat, but in some ways the Chinese are just so big that frankly the only way you can deter them and indeed fight them back is with nuclear weapons. So instead, what we actually see is a very, very rational form of reform that basically says, look, we're not going to be fighting a big war like that anymore. We are more likely to be involved in smaller, scrappier conflicts, wars of choice, which may well involve deploying our forces quite far from our borders. And therefore, actually, we need better, smaller, more flexible, more mobile forces. So, I mean, as one element of that, for example, the basic building block of the military shifts from being the division, which is a rather large and cumbersome, but nonetheless very kind of survivable force, into the smaller brigade. So, again, it's interestingly enough, these will end up coming back to bite the Russians in Ukraine. But in the short term, if you're thinking you're not going to be fighting a major war with, say, a country of more than 40 million people, actually, it allowed Russia to create, rather more sort of efficient, but nonetheless, relatively smaller scale mission oriented forces, which have capacity to, as we saw, you know, take Crimea very, very efficiently, fighting, or support an undeclared conflict in the Donbass, deploy to Syria. I mean, all of these things, actually, one could have questioned whether pre Georgia the Russians could have carried them off, or certainly not with anything like the same efficiency. So, it actually created the forces that could do this. But as I say, the irony is it also created forces that were then actually much less well suited to the kind of meat grinder conflict that they now find themselves in Ukraine.